So what we're going to do in this session is to build on that introduction from Martin, looking at some of the key obligations in GATS and the broad structure, and just work through some of the key obligations in the PACER Plus chapter. Now, some of these slides, I should say, I've realised a couple of things are going to be talked about by Martin in more detail tomorrow, so I'll skip over a couple of things a little bit more quickly, but we'll just go through. Now, like with the first session, there will be a quiz again at the end of this, so everyone be prepared. But I was very impressed with the response to the last quiz, so thanks very much. Again, please feel free to jump in with comments and questions whenever you like. Okay, so that's an overview of what we're looking at. But I will jump in and start with the national treatment obligation. So this is the article in PACER Plus on the screen, but I'll just jump forward and talk about some of the key elements. We might come back to this screen as we go. So what is national treatment about? Well, it's really about non-discrimination. And so the core of national treatment is that parties can't treat services or service suppliers from other PACER Plus parties less favourably than local suppliers. That's the core. So we're comparing the treatment of foreign service suppliers with similar domestic service suppliers. That's what national treatment is about. A couple of examples. Well, in a lot of countries, in most countries, there are certain sectors where the activity might be closed to foreigners, it might be restricted to local suppliers, local businesses. Also, there are often limits on the amount of foreign equity in some service sector businesses. These are both national treatment issues because they will affect the ability of a foreign service supplier to supply a service. Now, really importantly, under PACER Plus, and it's the same under GATS, is that national treatment only applies in sectors which are committed in the schedules. So only where a party lists a sector in its service schedule, that's the case where national treatment applies. If the sector isn't listed at all in the schedule, then national treatment doesn't apply. So it's again this positive list approach to making commitments, which Martin will examine in more detail tomorrow. Also, even where a party does make commitments in a sector, they agree to take on national treatment commitments, for example, in the retail sector. If they have any restrictions on foreign service supply, or maybe there's some kind of requirement which gives local suppliers a preference, that's okay, as long as it's set out in the schedule. So a couple of examples, and some of this might be a bit small if you're looking on the screen, but we'll talk through it anyway. Just have a few quick examples here, not going into the details of scheduling. Martin will talk about that tomorrow. But this is the schedule from Kiribati, and just focusing on their commitments on communication services. Now, communication services includes postal services, telecommunications, courier services, but we look at the schedule, you can see that Kiribati has made commitments on courier services. There are no commitments on postal services. So Kiribati has no commitments on postal services under PACER Plus for national treatment or market access. The sector has to be listed in the schedule. Also, if there are requirements that discriminate against foreign suppliers in the country, that won't be in breach of these obligations if it's set out in the schedule. And again, another example, all PACER Plus parties have some kinds of restrictions on ownership of foreign land. I know in a lot of countries it's not allowed at all. Foreigners can't own land in a lot of the PACER Plus parties, maybe all of them. But parties have set this out in their schedule, and this example is from, who is this? From Tuvalu. Because Tuvalu has set out this limitation that foreign persons can't own land in Tuvalu, that won't be in breach of national treatment. It is discriminatory. That's discriminatory. So if it wasn't set out, that could be in breach of national treatment. But it is included in the schedule, so Tuvalu has carved out that space. So it won't be in breach of the agreement. And other parties have done the same thing. Now I'm just going to touch on a couple of the key elements of national treatment, not going into too much detail in the legal interpretation, but just to give you a better sense of what it requires, what kind of things might be national treatment issues. So the first issue I want to talk about is this idea of less favourable treatment. Because with national treatment, you can't give foreign suppliers less favourable treatment than like domestic suppliers. So what does this mean? Well, it's actually explained in the national treatment article in PACER Plus, very similar to GATS. And so, excuse me, the article tells us the key question is whether different treatment of a foreign service supplier modifies the conditions of competition between domestic and foreign suppliers. Now that's a bit of a technical phrase, but if we simplify it, what it means is, does this different treatment of foreign service suppliers give the domestic suppliers a competitive advantage? Does it make an impact on how they can compete in the market? Because not every little difference in treatment is going to give domestic suppliers a competitive advantage. And a couple of examples. So the key issue is, if there is some difference, some different way that a requirement works for foreign suppliers, maybe there's a slightly different procedure, that doesn't mean there's always going to be a national treatment issue. The question is, what is the effect of this different treatment? Does it affect the market? Does it give domestic suppliers a competitive advantage? And so a couple of examples to try to make this a bit clearer, just hypothetical. So maybe there's an application form to supply a service, some process of authorisation in a sector. The fact that there's an additional form for foreign suppliers, maybe some additional questions, that's different treatment, and it might mean that foreign suppliers have to do slightly more, but that's not necessarily going to give domestic suppliers a competitive advantage. If it's a simple thing like that, so there is a difference, but if it doesn't affect the competitive relationship between the suppliers, if it doesn't give the domestic suppliers a competitive advantage, then that's probably not a national treatment issue. It's probably not a problem. So not every difference in treatment is going to be a breach of national treatment. That's the first example. Second example. Let's say in the retail sector, the government has imposed a minimum capital requirement. So when foreign businesses invest in retail in Tuvalu, let's say they have to invest at least 10 million US dollars. Well, that is going to affect the relationship between domestic and foreign suppliers, because effectively it sort of forces the foreign suppliers to open bigger retail stores, and so they're less likely to open smaller retail, and it's going to make it less attractive for them to do that because they have to make a big investment to be able to supply the service. And so this kind of requirement, this probably is going to be a national treatment issue. And so if we can see, the key question is, if there is a difference in treatment, does it affect the competitive relationship between a domestic supplier and a foreign supplier? Now, who do you compare? Who are we comparing? Well, it's only if there's different treatment between like suppliers. And what like suppliers means, basically it means comparable, similar. And this has been interpreted usually to focus on whether there's a competitive relationship between the domestic and foreign suppliers. So if they're in the same sector, that's usually going to be pretty clear. If you have a locally owned retail store and a foreign owned retail store, they're likely to be in competition. So they will probably be like service suppliers. Okay, most favoured nation treatment. So Martin has already touched on this in the WTO context, and the obligation is very similar in PACER Plus, and it also has similar elements to national treatment. Now, MFN is also concerned with discrimination, but with MFN, we're not comparing foreign suppliers with domestic suppliers. We're comparing suppliers from PACER Plus parties with any other foreign suppliers. That's who we're comparing under PACER Plus. So really the key question is there some kind of preferential treatment for service suppliers from a particular country? That's what gives rise to an MFN issue. If there's some kind of preference for certain countries or a group of countries in a certain area, that is a potential MFN issue. Now, we touched on this before, but there is also a way that parties can carve out certain kinds of requirements, certain kinds of preferences from MFN, and they do this in their annex on MFN exemptions. And for example, all parties carve out any preferences under existing FTAs. So any preferential treatment that any of the PACER Plus parties have given to service suppliers in a pre-existing agreement, that is carved out. So in effect, MFN only works forward under PACER Plus, only future preferences. Also, all Pacific Island countries have carved out any treatment under PICTA or a future protocol to PICTA. This is the example from Niue, and the text is small, so don't worry about trying to read it. But so what this means is that if in future the parties to PICTA agree to more favourable services commitments between them, or when the services protocol comes into force, when it's ratified by all of the parties, that will likely, well, that may well provide some preferential treatment within the PICTA parties. That would make sense. But that will not have to be passed on to the other PACER Plus parties because it's carved out of MFN. Now, I wanted to touch on a couple of the differences with MFN in an agreement like PACER Plus compared to in the GATS context. Now, one of the ways that MFN works in services agreements is that it potentially allows service suppliers to claim they're entitled to any more favourable treatment in future FTAs. So if in the future, let's say Australia agrees to an FTA with, who will I pick? Someone there's no FTA with, the list is getting smaller now. With, let's say with, I can't even, there's no EU. Australia and Kenya, there we go. if Australia gives more favourable treatment to Kenya than it agreed to give to the PACER Plus parties, well then the PACER Plus parties could point to the MFN obligation and say, well, you've guaranteed us most favoured nation treatment, so any better treatment you give to Kenyan service suppliers, you have to give the same to us. And unless Australia has some carve-out, which is relevant, then they would have to do that. That's the way MFN works. Now, I mentioned already that under PACER Plus, all parties have carved out any treatment under existing FTAs. So anything that's been done before under FTAs that are in force, that doesn't have to be passed on through MFN. But if there is preferential treatment that's not covered by one of these carve-outs, then that better treatment will have to be passed on. I'll just try to illustrate this with an example. So again, one way that FTAs are a bit different to GATS and the WTO. So this example, let's assume that there's two countries, A land and B land. I'm just going to straighten up this screen, excuse me for a sec. That's all right. Oh, it went all the way forward. I've given the game away now. All right. So an existing FTA, A land and B land, and A allows foreign suppliers from B land to acquire up to 49% ownership of telecommunications companies. So they made that commitment. Now, let's assume A land signs a new FTA with another country, C land. And in that FTA, they commit to better treatment. They say they will allow C land investors to acquire up to 51% ownership of telecommunications companies. Well, if MFN applies, A land will have to give that same better treatment to B land investors. And they will have to allow them to own up to 51% in a telecommunications company. Even though the treaty will still say 49%, because of the MFN obligation, they will have to pass on that better treatment unless there's an exemption which applies in the annex or some other exception. But that's the general operation of MFN. Feel free to jump in with any questions or any comments. All right, moving along. So we just looked at national treatment and MFN. They're both obligations concerned with protecting against non-discrimination. Now we're looking at market access, which is a different kind of obligation. So the same as national treatment, the market access obligation only applies in sectors where a party makes commitments in their schedule. So only where they've listed a sector in its schedule. But market access works differently. And that's because it's not concerned specifically with discrimination. The market access obligation prevents 6 specific types of restrictions on foreign service supply. And these are all listed in the market access article. So this includes restrictions on the number of service suppliers, on the quantity of output of a service sector business, on the number of people supplying a service, on the type of legal entity which a service can be supplied through, or on the amount of foreign ownership of a service sector business. Now, a few things I wanted to point out about the obligation is that apart from that last restriction on foreign equity limits, these restrictions are not necessarily discriminatory. So with market access, it doesn't matter if they apply equally to foreign and domestic suppliers. If they are one of these kinds of restrictions and you've made commitments in that sector, then they'll need to be set out in the schedule. So it's not necessarily about discrimination, it's different. So I know the elements of market access are pretty technical and it can be difficult to understand what they're concerned with. I have a few examples here just to touch on. I know that Martin will be talking about this more when he's working through the scheduling exercise, so I won't go into too much detail. But just to give you a sense of it, so what are limitations on the number of service suppliers? Well, for example, there might be a restriction where no foreign suppliers can supply a service at all. Well, that's like a zero quota. It means no service suppliers from another party are going to be able to supply the service at all. And that would be a restriction under that first limb. Limitations on the total value of transactions or assets. This is a bit more technical, but let's say, for example, that there's a restriction on foreign banks, and foreign banks can only hold 10% of total banking deposits. That's a limit on the total value of assets they can hold. It's a limitation on their business. Limitations on the total number of service operations. Well, let's say that there's a limitation on cruise boats, and cruise boat operators are only allowed to go on 3 cruises a week. That's a limitation on service output. Limitations on the number of people who can supply a service. I think that's more straightforward. For example, if a retail business is only allowed to employ up to 5 people, that would have to be scheduled in sectors where there are commitments. So restrictions on the type of legal entity that a service can be supplied through. So this might include, it's common in some countries that foreign suppliers can only establish in the country if they establish a joint venture with local suppliers. That would be covered by that limb. And foreign equity limits are also pretty straightforward. If there's a limitation on the amount of equity that foreign people can own in a service sector business, that would need to be scheduled in sectors where the parties made commitments. Now, most of these restrictions, so the first 4, they're all quantitative restrictions. So they're a limitation on the amount of something, and they apply to both numerical quotas or where the party imposes an economic needs test. I just thought worth briefly explaining what that means. I know some of the parties to PACER Plus have economic needs tests that apply in some areas. Now, this concept is not defined in the FTA. In broad terms, it's a test to allow the government to consider whether or not they want to agree to allow a service supplier to supply the service or to establish. And they often consider the impact on existing suppliers, the impact on the market, whether there is a need for additional suppliers, the impact on the area, all these kinds of factors. Okay, a few more points about market access. And one of the key differences to national treatment and MFN. With market access, the list of restrictions that you can't impose is exhaustive. And what I mean by that is, Often trade officials and negotiators talk about market access barriers in a broad sense to mean anything that might affect service supply. But the market access obligation isn't concerned with all of those world of trade barriers. It only prevents the restrictions that are set out in the market access article. So if a restriction doesn't fall in to one of those categories, then it doesn't have to be listed against market access. It won't be inconsistent with market access. So they are quite detailed and quite technical, but we do need to focus on the specific restrictions that are set out in the market access article, because that determines what we need to include in the schedules. Like national treatment, market access only applies in sectors where a party makes commitments in its schedule. So if the schedule doesn't refer to, let's say, telecommunications at all, you don't find telecommunications in a party schedule at all, then the market access obligation does not apply to the whole telecommunications sector. Even where a party has listed a sector in its schedule against market access, you won't be in breach of the market access article if you have set out the limitation or the restriction in the schedule. So the schedules are always key, and Martin will look at some of the details of that tomorrow. Yeah, so just an example here from UA. And this is the horizontal requirement that foreign enterprises seeking to carry on business in UA require registration by Cabinet. There's an economic needs test. So here we have an example of an economic needs test which is imposed by one of the parties. Now, that would be a market access issue because UA is saying if a foreign supplier, excuse me, if a foreign supplier wants to come and, let's say, set up a new hotel in UA, we might approve that. We might not. We will decide these factors. We will look at how this affects the market and all these other kinds of issues, and we will decide whether to allow them or not. So that is a limitation on the number of suppliers. It depends on this test, but those kinds of limitations have to be scheduled in sectors where UA makes commitments. So that would be an issue, and if this wasn't set out in the schedule, then it would be inconsistent with market access. But UA has set it out, and so it won't be in breach of market access. It can maintain this requirement. It can continue to require that any foreign suppliers go through this cabinet approval process, and UA may or may not approve them. They've preserved that space. Okay, so they're what I often think of as being the core market access obligations in the PACER Plus chapter. I'm just going to move to look at excuse me, some of the other provisions now. And some of these are a bit more specific. So the first one is concerned with monopoly and exclusive service suppliers. Now, in some countries, there might be a service which is, maybe it's not supplied by the government, but there is a monopoly supplier, just one supplier. Only one supplier is allowed to supply it. Probably because it wouldn't make sense for more than one to supply it because the market's too small, for example, and so they don't want to open it up to competition. There might also be a case where there's not a single monopoly supplier, but there's a small number of exclusive suppliers that are allowed to supply a service. Maybe 2 or 3 telecommunication suppliers, for example, and they're the only ones that can supply a certain service. Well, PACER Plus has some rules around this. So if the country does allow these kinds of monopoly or exclusive service suppliers, then they have to ensure that those suppliers comply with these obligations of most favoured nation, national treatment, and market access. So basically those monopoly or exclusive suppliers can't discriminate against suppliers from other PACER Plus parties. So basically this provision recognises that monopoly suppliers, exclusive service suppliers will have a degree of power in the market, and so it's a discipline to ensure that they don't abuse that power, that they don't use it in a way which would be a market access barrier or to discriminate against suppliers from other PACER Plus parties. I'm going to skip right over domestic regulation because I misread the agenda. I didn't realise that Martin's covering this in detail tomorrow. So I'm going to move right through this. Martin will address domestic regulation under both GATS and PACER Plus. So I won't focus on that. I will stop now at recognition. PACER Plus includes an obligation concerned with recognition. Well, what is this about? What does it mean? Well, in many professions or services, there are requirements for suppliers to meet certain criteria to supply a service. So they might need to be authorised, they might need to have a certain level of education, they might need to have certain qualifications, that's very common, they might need to have certain licences. Now, recognition is where one country recognises the experience or education or licenses or qualifications of a supplier gained in another country. So if one country says that a supplier has all the experience and qualifications they need to supply a service in that country, a second country can recognise that experience and those qualifications and say, you can also supply the service in our country. So this can be a really significant barrier to trade-in services because, well, if people are not qualified to supply a service, they won't be able to do it. So it's an important issue and a potential trade barrier. Now, generally, the way that countries grant recognition is on a reciprocal basis under what's often called a mutual recognition agreement or mutual recognition arrangement. And so two countries might say, okay, well, if you recognise our suppliers who meet these requirements, who have a degree with 3 years experience and have achieved these qualifications, we will recognise your suppliers in the same field who have the same, equivalent experience and qualifications. So it requires countries to be confident in each other's licensing and approval systems, but they can do that. So that's what recognition is, and just to focus on what PACER Plus says about it. I won't focus on the detail of the text. Now, PACER Plus is based on GATS here, like many other obligations that we've seen so far. And one key point is that under PACER Plus, there's no requirement for, I think I've just lost my mic. I think the battery might have died. I don't know if we have a backup. I can speak without it, but my voice is a little bit catchy. I'll try that one, thanks. Thanks. How are we going? Yeah, that's good. So there's no obligation for a PACER Plus party to recognise qualifications or experience in another PACER Plus party. What Article 11 says is that it allows parties to choose whether they recognise qualifications and experience in another party or for suppliers from a particular party. Now, as Martin mentioned, this is kind of an exclusion from MFN, because in general, if one of the PACER Plus countries only recognised qualifications from one of the other PACER Plus parties, that could be inconsistent with MFN because it's more favourable to suppliers from one of the parties. But Article 11 says you can do that. So you can choose whether you recognise the qualifications or experience from a particular country or not. Countries can do that. It's up to them. But the key requirement under PACER Plus is if a party does agree to a mutual recognition arrangement, if they do agree to recognise experience gained and qualifications with another country, they have to give other PACER Plus parties an opportunity to negotiate a comparable arrangement. So you don't automatically have to give the same treatment, but you have to give other PACER Plus parties a chance to negotiate an agreement where you will recognise the experience and qualifications that their service suppliers have gained in that country. There's a couple of other requirements. You can't use these recognition arrangements in a way that would be discriminatory or a disguised restriction on trade. So you can't use them as a trade barrier. Countries are included to try to negotiate on the basis of internationally agreed criteria, so if there are kind of standards. And parties are also encouraged to encourage their professional bodies to explore setting up these mutual recognition arrangements between themselves. So whoever the professional bodies are in your countries, parties are encouraged to ask them to explore whether it would make sense to set up a mutual recognition arrangement under PACER Plus. Okay, a couple of other obligations. One is concerned with payments and transfers. So similar to GATS, as Martin mentioned, this commitment only applies to sectors where a party has made commitments. So only where there are specific commitments set out in its schedule. Now, where a party has made commitments in a sector in its schedule, then in general, it can't restrict payments or transactions related to service transactions in those sectors. That's the general rule. There are some specific exceptions, which we'll look at, and they depend on the kind of transaction we're talking about. So for current transactions, and so what I mean by this is basically payment for services, payment for services exports, for example, where there's a payment from Samoa to a foreign service supplier who's supplying cross-border financial advice, let's say. That's a current transaction. So parties are not allowed to impose any restrictions on those payments except where it's justified by the security exception. And we'll talk about the exceptions in a second. So that's pretty limited. Basically, there's very limited scope to impose any kind of restriction on payments for those kinds of service transactions. For capital transactions, and so these are mainly related to Mode 3 investment in services. So where a foreign supplier is making an investment to establish a services business, or maybe they've sold the business and they want to transfer the proceeds back home. Countries can only impose restrictions on those kinds of transfers Where this is justified by another exception, the balance of payments safeguard. So pretty limited grounds to restrict payments and transfers in sectors where you've made specific commitments. So this balance of payments safeguard, it says when parties can restrict payments on payments or transfers, and in general, it's only in the case where there's serious balance of payments difficulties and external financial difficulties. So pretty serious situation. If there are these kinds of circumstances, then parties can restrict payments and transfers related to trade in services only in that situation, but there are some conditions. So it can't be any more restrictive than necessary. It also has to avoid unnecessary damage to other parties, has to be temporary and phased out when the balance of payment situation improves. And they can't be discriminatory. So you can't just impose restrictions on suppliers from one country, for example. It has to be non-discriminatory. All right, well, that's a quick survey of some of the kind of regulatory disciplines. Just going to move quickly now to look at transparency. And again, I won't go read through the text, that's just there on the slide for a reference. But just to recognise that there are two separate areas of PACER Plus that contain transparency obligations that apply to the services chapter. So the first is in the services chapter itself. And so the services chapter, it contains a couple of pretty brief requirements. So there's a requirement to establish contact points to respond to requests from other parties on any measures of general application affecting trade in services. Now that term is drawn from the GATS as well. Essentially it means requirements that apply to service suppliers in general, not a specific decision in a specific case, but rules which apply to the broad category of service suppliers. So there's a requirement to establish contact points. So that's not very detailed. There's also a requirement to publish any of these measures of general application relating to licensing requirements and procedures, qualification requirements, and technical standards. So these have to be published promptly under PACER Plus, but the obligation is qualified and it's to the extent of a party's capacity. So if there are restraints on its ability to be able to publish measures, then this is not an absolute obligation. It recognises that parties might have different capacities to publish these measures. So they're the obligations in the services chapter. The general obligations in the transparency chapter apply to all chapters, including services. So just to touch on these quickly, there's an obligation to publish a whole range of measures affecting services. There's also requirements to provide notice where the country plans to introduce a new measure, and a reasonable opportunity to comment on any proposed requirements affecting services. But in most cases, these obligations are all qualified. So they're not strict obligations you have to meet in every single case. They recognise that there'll be situations where it might be hard to meet these, and recognise that countries have different capacities. So, for example, parties have to promptly publish all requirements relating to services wherever possible. It may not be possible, and in electronic form if possible. And it may not be in all cases. They also have to publish any proposed new regulations affecting services in advance, if possible, and give parties an opportunity to comment where appropriate. So that's a bit more qualified. In some cases, the government might think it's not appropriate. There might be urgency. They might need to bring in this regulation quickly. There might not be time to allow service suppliers to comment beforehand. So there are these qualifications on the transparency obligations. Yeah. I won't go through the detailed text, just showing you where these are in the services and transparency chapters. Okay, I'm going to touch on now the exceptions. And one of our colleagues I know mentioned the exceptions in the introduction, that it was something that they were keen to learn more about. So I'm just going to provide an overview of some of the core exceptions and explain the areas where they operate, the kinds of areas where they give parties a bit of flexibility. So the first exceptions I'm going to look at are these general exceptions. Now, PACER Plus incorporates the GATS general exceptions into the services chapter. Now, what they mean is that even if some action by the government would be in breach of the services obligations, it won't be in breach of the treaty if it's justified by these general exceptions. Now, they apply in certain policy areas. So it includes protection of human, animal or plant life or health, protection of public morals, conservation, protection of the environment, and taxation. So they apply in these specific areas. Now, this is the GATS general exceptions. I won't go through all this text, except just to show you what it is, because this isn't actually set out in the PACER Plus agreement. They just refer to it and incorporate it that way. What PACER Plus does, though, it doesn't just include the GATS exceptions, it includes two additional exceptions. And these are relating to conservation of natural resources and measures necessary to protect cultural works or support creative arts. So in this way, PACER Plus goes beyond GATS and it gives parties more flexibility in these specific areas. So more flexibility in relation to environmental conservation measures, more flexibility to support creative arts and cultural expression. And so in this way, there's more policy space for parties under PACER Plus than there is under the GATS. So there are exceptions to allow governments to take measures in these policy areas, but they have to meet the conditions. There are conditions you need to satisfy to be able to use the exceptions to justify actions. First of all, the government action or the requirement has to fit into one of the categories, one of the policy areas which are listed. So for example, if it's necessary to protect public health, that will fall within one of the exceptions. Or if it's relating to the conservation of natural resources, that will fit in one of the categories. So that's the first step. I'm not going to go into the legal detail of this, but just to flag that some of these categories are more limited than others. And the language matters. For example, it's easier to justify some kind of government requirement as relating to conservation than it is to prove that it's necessary for conservation. So some of them are easier to satisfy than others, and that's the way they've been interpreted in the WTO. But I won't go into that too much now. That's the first element. The second element is that we have to satisfy the test in the introduction to the exceptions. So these tests are that the measure is not applied in a way that would amount to arbitrary or unjustifiable discrimination, and that it's not a disguised restriction on trade. So it has to satisfy all of these conditions. Again, there's lots of detailed interpretation of that in the WTO. I won't go into that. Essentially, it's designed to ensure that countries aren't abusing the exceptions, that they are using them in cases where they're being used in a genuine way, not as a disguised barrier to trade. Okay, that's the general exceptions. Moving now to the security exceptions. Well, PACER Plus includes an exception for certain actions, certain requirements to protect certain essential security interests. Now, in one sense, this is broader than the general exceptions because it doesn't have the same conditions to satisfy it. Now, the PACER Plus security exception is based on the exception in GATS. It's similar. And so it applies to certain specific security interests, which reflect the core security concerns. Now, there is a broad exception to withhold information where this is necessary to protect essential security. So countries do not have to disclose information or allow information to be published or transferred cross-border, for example, if that's necessary to protect their essential security interests. And their essential security interests are up to them. In addition, there's a broad exception for parties to take certain measures for certain kinds of essential security interests. And I'm simplifying these, but they include measures related to nuclear materials, services for a military establishment, measures to protect critical infrastructure from attack, so power, water, communications from attack, or measures in time of war or emergency in international relations. There's also a broad exception to allow parties to fulfil obligations under the UN Charter. So these cover core security interests, but it's not the whole world of potential security issues. For example, it doesn't refer to food security. It allows parties to take measures for certain specific essential security interests. I've highlighted that critical infrastructure exception because this is additional to GATS. So in this respect, PACER Plus provides a bit more flexibility than GATS to allow measures to protect critical infrastructure. This is the article from PACER Plus. I won't go through that now. Yeah. So it gives parties quite a scope to take measures that are necessary to protect their essential security interests. And of course, different countries will have different ideas about which measures are necessary. And so they do have discretion to decide that. But it's probably not unlimited discretion. Basically, countries would have to be able to justify that the measures they're taking are to protect one of these security interests if it came down to it. Okay, I think this might be the final exception that I'm looking at. This is the prudential exception. Now, it's particularly relevant to financial regulators, central banks. But it's really important because it provides broad policy space for prudential regulation. So it confirms that nothing in the agreement prevents a party from taking prudential measures. So a couple of key points. It's a broad exception for prudential measures. It's not subject to the same kinds of disciplines as the general exceptions, for example. Now, what do prudential measures mean? Well, to some of you that might be obvious, but for those of you who aren't involved with financial regulation, well, the article does include a list of prudential reasons. They include protection of investors, depositors and policyholders, and also measures to ensure the integrity and stability of the financial system. So all these measures to ensure that the financial system is working properly, that it's not collapsing, that depositors, consumers aren't losing their money, all fall within this category of prudential reasons. But importantly, the scope of the exception isn't limited to these specific prudential reasons. It's broader than that. And in the WTO context, it's been interpreted in a way that it can evolve over time. So it's a broad exception to allow financial regulators to ensure that the financial system is operating properly and securely. There is one condition, and that's that any measures for prudential reasons shouldn't be used as a means of avoiding a party's obligations under the agreement. So it can't be used as a disguised barrier on trade, but it's a less demanding test than the test for general exceptions, for example. So quite a bit of policy space for financial regulators against all the obligations under the FTA.